Who has been manipulating Palestinian casualty figures and why? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with the researcher and analyst, Matthew Cockerill. Matt Cockerill, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Nice to see you, Maureen.
Our discussion today will focus on casualty statistics, their manipulation, and the implications of getting the numbers right or wrong for that matter. So let me start by asking you about your own sources. Where do you get your data? What concerns have been raised about your data, and why do you nevertheless consider the data that you use reliable? Simply put, why should we trust you and not those you are criticizing and denouncing as charlatans?
Well, the core source that I've relied on, there are others, more specifically open source studies and to some extent survey data. But the core source I've relied on is the cue the ominous, satanic music, the Ministry of Health in Gaza. And
The
of course,
Hamas-run
the
Hamas Ministry of
Hamas-run
Hamas Health.
satanic Ministry of yes,
Yeah.
but so one might reasonably ask. I don't think it's an unreasonable question. How could you trust these people? Aren't they run by a co-belligerent, this horrible organization, so forth? Uh, the issue people have who want to dispute the veracity of these data, there are many issues they have. For one, as a story in Vice in January 2024 showed, as other reports have showed, the United States and Israel themselves consider these data to be reliable. They're also having to contend with history, which has shown that these data are within a few percentage points in their demographics and total raw number of fatalities they describe in Cast-Lead Protective Edge and other recent
So this is a record
conflicts.
going back to 2008, 2009,
Correct.
2014, and so on.
And most compellingly, virtually every name in their list is identified, meaning there's age, name, and Lewin algorithm compliant Israel issued ID numbers. It would be very difficult to fake this, and my research through open sources indicates that it is not, in fact, faked. So it's basically the corroboration, the transparency, the historical evidence. And then one other thing I'd point out, the willingness to contradict Hamas. So Hamas has insisted throughout the war that 70% of fatalities are women and minors. The
And
Ministry
just
of
to
Health.
interrupt you, you're now contrasting the Ministry of Health with the Government Press Office or Ministry of Information.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and I would not consider the government media office to be a reliable source. Doesn't mean we can't look at it, but we should be very skeptical because they have produced misinformation. But regarding the fatalities, the government media office has insisted 70% are women and minors throughout the war, and the Ministry of Health went along with this claim early on when it was somewhat tenable statistically, but has since given interviews to Sky News said, no, that's wrong, right? That's not correct. It's not 70% women and minors. It's like a bare majority women and children.
Just
So
over 50%.
correct. So the willingness to contradict Hamas also adds to the credibility in my view. So, and then I've also engaged in open source research, gone through large numbers of these fatalities
And
and
what do you
found
mean by open source?
essentially looking at social media. That's the main source. Looking at social media and seeing, are there families talking about this or that person having been killed that's listed on the Ministry of Health list?
Mhm.
And Airwars
And
did this as well and found thousands of fatalities from the Ministry of Health listed in October 2023 that are real. So I'm very confident that these data are accurate and robust. I'm not
and
saying there aren't
just
mistakes. Yeah.
yeah, what would you say to people who say, well, you can post anything on social media, so you could have the Ministry of Health faking names and numbers and then faking accounts of families claiming people who are either still alive or who never existed have been killed by the Israelis.
Well, I don't expect they have enough time in their hands to do that. But if you're being professional about researching, doing open source research, lights a light bulb will go off if this is the first post from an account. The account was created yesterday, and then they're announcing the fatality today. That's not the case with the ones I've found. They're long-standing accounts. They're talking about the banalities and joys of life 5 years ago, and then more recently, they're talking about the death of a family member.
Mhm.
And then also pictorial evidence would be very difficult to fake. So it just seems to me extraordinarily unlikely that these data aren't accurate, which again, the Israelis, the Americans behind closed doors seem to think they are.
When they're not producing Pallywood.
Yeah, all right, yeah. Hmm.
Mhm. So to get into specifics, your first report was published in October of last year, October 2024. It was published by the British NGO Action on Armed Violence, or
Mhm.
AOAV. And in this report, you examined Israel's claims that Palestinian casualties in the Gaza Strip were evenly divided between civilians and combatants. In other words, um, uh, had a one-to-one ratio. You concluded that, in fact, and in sharp contrast to Israel's claims, at least 74% of Palestinian casualties were civilian non-combatants. How did you arrive at this figure?
So to get the figure of at least 74% of fatalities being civilians, I made two basic assumptions. So I work with the Ministry of Health data. So
Mhm.
what we just
Which
talked
we've just
about,
discussed.
that's one assumption as well, I suppose, that these data are accurate, but I think that's well supported. There's two other assumptions that allowed me to draw the at least 74%, which by the way is conservative figure. The first is that persons from demographics, literally all, I'm not talking about most, I'm talking about literally all of whom were civilians in the previous Gaza war. So we're talking children 14 and under. We're not talking older boys, 15, 16, 17. We're talking women and we're talking men over 65. I assume that these are also civilians this time around. And again, that's just based on the historical evidence that literally all of these people were civilians in cast lead and protective edge. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is a little bit more complicated. And it may seem counterintuitive at first. I assume that at least as many male civilians have been killed in Gaza as female. So um, why would I assume that? Well, it's again based on historical fatalities data.
From the Gaza Strip.
From Gaza and other wars, consistently in war, more adult men are civilians, not just combatants, but more adult male civilians are killed than female. This is
Sorry, but that's kind of a global phenomenon, not particular.
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. It's true of Gaza. It's
Mhm.
true. It's true of cast lead and protective edge,
Mhm.
and it's true of, for example, the Syrian civil war. About six times as many adult male civilians were killed as adult female
Not
civilians.
adult males, adult male civilians.
Correct. If
Yeah.
you included combatants, it would be an even larger
Mhm.
disparity. In Iraq, the ratio is more than 10 to 1 of civilians
Mhm.
to adult male civilians to adult female civilians killed. And the reason for this is if you even look at pictures of Gaza right now, you see it's more likely, of course, there are women about trying to get food and shelter for their families. But if you see these pictures, for example, of these Gazans trying to get aid the other day, who are virtually all going to be civilians, most of them are men, most of them are males. So these disparities, which are consistent in war, I simply assume will apply to the case of the current Gaza war. And there's overwhelming,
In other words, s- male civilians are more likely to be out and about seeking
yes.
essential supplies, housing, selling goods to make money, whatever it is, much more likely to be men than women.
Exactly. And enemy forces have more access to adult male civilians than adult female. Incidentally, we saw this on October 7th.
Mm.
If you look at civilians killed on October 7th, over 70% are adult males.
Mhm.
And that's not because this was a discriminate attack by Hamas. It certainly wasn't. It's because there was more access to adult men. And you have that in Gaza too. And therefore, there's every reason, historical and logical, to assume at least as many adult male civilians have been killed as female. So if you make those two assumptions, that the 100%, talking literally everybody, civilian demographics from the previous wars are also basically 100% this time around, could be wrong by some negligible amount. Maybe there's three women who are combatants, but wouldn't matter statistically. And you assume at least as many male civilians, adult male civilians have been killed as female, you get this figure of at least 74%
Mhm.
civilians killed.
And given that you're basing it on a number of assumptions, rather than, let's say, direct, documented, and verifiable evidence, why do you consider this to be a reliable figure?
Well, I would say it's not merely assumptions. These are utterly consistent, breathtakingly consistent. If you look at, and by the way, one of my co-authors and a world expert on counting civilian casualties in war, Mike Spagat,
Mhm.
is currently posting actually on Twitter, Professor Spagat is, a list of wars, historical wars, and describing the number of men, women, and children killed. And again, this is an utterly consistent, an incorrigible trend. More adult male civilians killed than female.
Mhm.
And if you assume that, and if you assume, I think very rationally, that groups that are literally 100% civilian in the previous wars are also about 100% in this war, you get this figure of at least 74% civilians.
And nevertheless, why should we simply discount the confirmation of Israel's claims by multiple researchers who, unlike you, have actually been to the Gaza Strip, have spoken extensively with Israeli officials, and claim that they independently arrived at the same figures being put forward by the Israeli government?
Yeah, so I think we're talking about three people in particular here,
Yes.
John Spencer, Salo Eisenberg, and Mr. Andrew Fox.
And
Um,
Douglas Murray, I think, is a fourth.
Oh, sure. I mean, if we're talking about have you been, you have to say it with a posh English accent,
Mm,
Maureen. That was weak, man.
mm.
But the problem with these guys is, in essence, they're working back. So people can criticize my assumptions. I think they're very solid, inductively extremely solid, based on military history and so on. But people can criticize my assumptions. But it's pretty clear I have had these assumptions. These are the assumptions I've been operating with since I engaged in my research, since I began my research. These guys are clearly operating on a predetermined conclusion that the Ministry of Health data are wrong and that Israel's right about 1-to-1 or whatever, and are trying to find all kinds of rationales for it post hoc. And they abandon one rationale when it stops working. So, for example, Fox and
Andrew
Eisenberg,
Fox.
yeah,
Mm,
Eisenberg were pushing this idea that I don't know about Spencer, but Fox and Eisenberg definitely were pushing this idea that many months ago, over a year ago maybe, that IDs, at one point, the Ministry of Health in their list had fake IDs for a number of people. These IDs were not Israel issued. They were not Loon
and
algorithm
just to
compliant. Mhm,
clarify, in the Palestinian population registry, whether in the West Bank
mhm.
under Palestinian Authority control or the Gaza Strip that has been under Hamas rule since 2007, every every newborn is given an identification figure, or perhaps they're given it when they turn 16 or something, and that number is issued not by the Palestinians but by the Israeli population registry. Correct?
Correct.
Mm,
Yeah. And again, they're Loon algorithm compliant numbers too.
mm,
It's a specific algorithm that credit cards have. So if one is faking it, one could determine that pretty quickly. But anyway, a bunch of these ID numbers were clearly fake. And I think reasonable researchers said, what's going on here? Maybe there's a problem here. Whereas Fox and Eisenberg immediately jumped to, oh, this is fake, these are invented deaths, and so on. And then it turned out the Ministry of Health, in later iterations of their list, said our system went down, so we had to invent dummy ID numbers to
to register
classify.
deaths.
Exactly. And
Mm,
then they eventually, when their systems came back up, I think during the ceasefire, though maybe earlier, they were able to fix all of these errors.
mm,
So that's an example. So they come out with, oh, these are fake. And then the problem is corrected and they just pretend it didn't happen. And they
mm.
come up with another reason why things are fake. Like, for example, they claim natural deaths are systematically included in the Ministry of Health data. If that were true, we'd see an overrepresentation of children aged 0. We would see more very, very old people on the list than we do, greater number of very, very elderly people on the list than we
Because they
do
tend to
now.
die naturally in greater
Yeah, the
numbers. Mm,
death rates of very elderly people, sadly, are very high, right? Your chance of dying if you're 80 or 90 in a year is even higher than, in most wars or genocides, right? It's
mm.
like 20%, 30%. 40%, 50%, depending on how old you are. So the numbers don't make sense for a systematic inclusion of natural death. So the point is, where I'd say I'm more credible is I have clear assumptions. They're extremely well supported by historical evidence, and they just have ad hoc reasons to justify a predetermined conclusion.
Okay, ad hoc reasons, but you've spoken about that you have this reservoir of data buttressed by assumptions that you've been able to
Mhm.
test historically and globally, if I understood you correctly. What is the evidence the Israelis have been putting forward to buttress their claims about the ratio of civilians to combatants?
The problem is there's virtually none. They don't have any.
They just make the claim.
This differentiates. This is a differentiation between the Ministry of Health and Gaza. The Ministry of Health in Gaza has published numerous iterations of their lists. They have transparency. They've mentioned in interviews with the Western media where they think they made mistakes in the past. Right? They've corrected errors. These are all the marks of serious research to me. It's not that you never make mistakes, but it's that you correct it and acknowledge it, right? You don't hide them, you correct them and acknowledge them, which they've done. Israel simply issues figures. They issue ratio estimates and they issue estimates of combatants killed, and they provide no transparency as to how they calculate it. They give no names virtually, or some teeny percentage of them. And because of
So
the
they
lack
don't
of
give you reams of lists the way
Right. They
some
don't, they
go.
just don't, there's no transparency or evidence. So that's essentially the problem. And that's why I think people who believe Israel, they are just doing it out of either political bias or ideological bias that, oh, Israel's a democratic state, Hamas is a terror group, so we have to believe Israel. But I think if your epistemology is the latter, you're going to end up making a lot of excuses for atrocities committed by democratic or Western regimes, if we want to call Israel those things, which is controversial, but yeah.
And how would you respond to people who say, okay, we accept that your data is reliable and we understand the assumptions that you're making, but the Ministry of Health has never once distinguished between civilian casualties and combatants. So how are you able to do this? Do you have some unique insight into something that the Ministry of Health is either unable or unwilling to provide?
It's simply the demographics. If yeah, we don't know that the Ministry of Health may not assert that a 10-year-old is a civilian, but we can know that,
Mhm.
right? Virtual certainty and total certainty for really for young children. Um, so yeah, I would say you can make inductive demographics-based arguments by looking at the historical data. You can't necessarily say this one person, let's say
This
uh,
individual.
this one 17-year-old boy is a combatant or civilian. You can't say that,
Mhm.
but you can assess odds. And in this case, he's very, very likely a civilian, even though that's not 100% certain, given his, that Hamas has had in the historical data. And in the current war, they have had 15, 16, 17-year-old combatants. So no, you can't know for sure which percentage it is, but I think you can absolutely, based on the demographics of the dead, draw ranges.
Mhm.
And I will say again that 74% is on the lower end
Lower
of
end.
the range. Yeah.
And so if I can sum up what you're saying, you're basically saying you're not making determinations about specific individual cases,
Mhm.
but you have full confidence in kind of the aggregate figures that you're providing.
Correct, correct. They're probabilistic assessments.
Yeah.
So there are this many 12-year-olds, there are this many 16-year-olds, there are this many
Mm.
20-year-old women, etc. And what is the odds in the aggregate that they are combatants? That's exactly it.
So that's the discussion of the data. But when we look at the larger picture, what, if anything, are the implications of your findings on this specific issue?
Well, the implications are that this is one of the most, in terms of uh, attacking of civilians, killing of civilians, is one of the most indiscriminate killing of civilians in a war since the Second World War. If you look at the proportion of civilians to combatants killed, this would be worse than the Vietnam War waged by the United States. This would be similar or worse than Assad's siege of Aleppo.
Mhm.
Um, this would be likely be worse unless you look at the most kind of outlandish estimates, but I'll say worse than the siege of Grozny. So this is an extreme outlier case.
Mm.
And here it's important to point out one other reason why I call John Spencer a charlatan. So Spencer has promoted this popular myth that on average 90% of civilian casualties in war are are civilians. 90% of total casualties in war are civilians.
And
And
urban warfare.
yeah, and it's not true. Mike Spaggett has ha my co-author Mike Spaggett, again a world-leading expert on these civilian casualty assessments in war, has shown that it's about 1 to 1 on average in war and about 1.5 to 2 to 1 on average in urban warfare. So this is just a
So sorry to
popular
interrupt,
myth.
but when, and it's not only those who are invested in promoting the Israeli version of events who have bandied about this figure of a 9-to-1 ratio. Many people who are not specialized in military history or warfare or the demographics of casualties also assume it to be true. So you're basically saying this assertion that 90% of casualties in urban warfare across the globe in recent decades have been civilians is an urban myth.
Yeah, it's a popular myth,
Mhm.
exactly.
Mhm.
It's something that people who haven't studied the subject seriously believe. And the reason I say Spencer's a charlatan in a way, I wouldn't say some 18-year-old whom I'm teaching who believes this is a charlatan, obviously, is that Spencer says Netanyahu says that Spencer told him, he said that in his speech to the Congress, that he has studied every urban war in history,
Mm.
right?
And
So
counted every dead.
to believe this, like for example, Stalingrad and Leningrad, genocidal urban warfare, right, by the Nazis, well below 9 to 1. Hiroshima is probably somewhere around 9 to 1 or a little bit worse. Nagasaki is much worse because of it's infinitely worse because there weren't a lot of soldiers there. But the fact that Hiroshima is similar to 9 to 1, maybe a little higher, should show you that
Well, you're also
this is
talking about
the nuclear bombing.
nuclear explosion,
Yeah,
not urban warfare.
correct. Yeah, but the fact that it's near this so-called average, I
Mm.
think proves a totally indiscriminate attack. Shows how ludicrous it is.
Mm. So we've mentioned our good friend John Spencer. I believe he has some kind of affiliation with West Point.
Mm.
So turning now, to the key advocates of Israel's version of casualty figures, seem to be figures like John Spencer, Andrew Fox of the Henry Jackson Society, which is known as a very right-wing pro-Israeli outfit based in the United States, and Salo Eisenberg of an even more pro-Israeli outfit known as Camera, and I think others affiliated with the Henry Jackson Society as well. Tell us a bit more about these researchers and institutions, and perhaps if there are others I should have mentioned in this context as well.
Well, I think that these guys have, they all are committed, as I said before, to a predetermined conclusion that Israel is doing the right thing.
Not
They're
only is it
not,
doing the right thing, it's the most moral
yeah,
army in the world. There is
most
no
moral,
example in all of recorded history
correct.
in which an army has demonstrated such extraordinary concern to avoid
Yeah.
civilian casualties. There can't possibly be genocide, and so on.
Surely, yeah, and they're willing to bend historical and contemporary evidence to get their claims right. One thing that's shocked me about Spencer, he's a guy who served in the U.S. military, is in
Well,
order
he would know all
to,
about civilian casualties.
well, yes, but it's interesting. He actually continually distorts the number of civilians the U.S. military killed in Mosul to try to make Israel look better in comparison. The idea is if the U.S. was this bad and the U.S. is good, maybe Israel, by being similar or maybe slightly worse, slightly better, isn't so bad. But what he actually has done is he has attributed in what he's done in his distortion of an Associated Press study on civilian fatalities in Mosul, is he's attributed thousands of civilians killed by ISIS to the U.S. coalition in order to make the U.S. military look worse and therefore to make Israel look
Just,
better in
just a minute.
comparison.
This is a
Yeah.
guy who actually served in the U.S.
Yeah,
military,
yeah,
constantly brags about
yeah.
having served the flag and so on. And you're saying he is now smearing, I presume knowingly, his own country, the military he
Yeah.
served in order to make a foreign state and a foreign military look good, look better. Is that what your claim is?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I guess I can't definitively prove intent. He could just be so completely sloppy that he
Mhm.
just repeats false over and over again. But yeah, he's misrepresented an AP study. He either didn't read the study. That would be the best,
Yeah.
I guess, best interpretation. Or he's lying. But he misrepresents an AP study which shows about one third of 10,000 fatalities, civilian fatalities in Mosul, were killed by the U.S. coalition, about a third by ISIS, and about a third of undetermined. They couldn't quite determine the attribution. He attributes all of these to the U.S. military, to the U.S. coalition, to make Israel look better in comparison. The point is to jack up the number of civilians the U.S. killed, and make the U.S.'s ratio look worse to make Israel look better in comparison. Yeah. So
And these are people who proclaim themselves to be the world's leading experts
yeah,
on
it's
this.
it's it's quite shocking. I mean, again, here he either doesn't read a study and refuses to listen to corrections. Hey, you haven't read this study, dude. Or he's lying about the US military to make Israel look better. I mean, take your
Yeah.
pick.
Then
Fox,
Fox,
I'll say mention one quick thing about Fox. We could go on all day with these guys, but
he's a former British officer, I believe.
yeah, yeah, and he also
Contributed to the catastrophe in Afghanistan, I think, or
I
Iraq. I'm
don't know
not sure.
exact
Yeah.
I don't know about the particulars of his his service record, but Fox, what I'd say about Fox is there was a child decapitated by an Israeli airstrike, which he called a shit attempt at faking an atrocity.
Well, one of
So
those. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So he does the Hollywood thing. I mean, it's just that Western intellectuals have fallen to this level.
And you
Um,
had a personal encounter with Fox, I believe, if you don't mind me asking.
oh yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So by the way, the child Fox said was a doll and a shit attempt at faking an atrocity was named Ahmed and Najjar. Like I looked into this as a real person, of course. But yeah, he reported me Fox. So I'm a PhD student and teach at London School of Economics.
Mhm.
And he reported me and tried to get me sanctioned and to ruin my career basically. He
Sanctioned by
reported
your
me in a
university.
yeah, he reported me in a form that's reserved for very serious misconduct. We're talking about professors who sexually abuse students. That's one of the things this form mentions. Or professors who like racially bully a student. So we're talking really egregious misconduct for which I think any reasonable person would say a professor should be or a teacher should be fired. And instead, it's this dude who's never met me, and it obviously isn't a student, is reporting me for calling him a charlatan on the internet. I
Huh.
mean, this is the form he used, and
Well, judging by what you're saying, I think the obvious question is what took you so damn long?
yeah, exactly, exactly. But I mean, the fact that he was willing to go to these lengths was, and when I heard I was reported on this, I was confident that I actually was sure because I know my students. Uh, I knew this wasn't one of them. I knew it was some internet person.
Mhm.
I had like a few people in mind. I'm like, yeah, it's one of these people. Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. But my university, to its credit, I think the British scene is much better. They completely stood by me. They didn't seem to really take, well, I don't want to say they didn't take it seriously because Fox did complain and then they read it, right? But they dismissed it. They definitely didn't view it as having any merit.
So this
So,
wasn't a Columbia or Harvard
right.
situation.
But I will say he's a columnist for this free speech, intellectual dark
Of
web
course. Yeah.
website,
He's a free speech absolutist,
Quill.
I presume.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the intellectual environment is better in Britain than in America. I feel sorry for my friends in America,
Yeah.
and that are dealing with that climate. But yeah, that's the kind of guy he is. And Eisenberg was saying nobody's hungry in Gaza. This kind of
Yeah. And
nonsense.
and Fox and Eisenberg often produce agitprop together, I believe.
Yeah, they're co-authors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
John
there anything?
Spencer is a co-author of that guy who says he says like they're all Hamas. And he did the no innocent civilians thing, that human rights lawyer guy.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
I can't remember his name.
yeah, Ostrovsky or something.
Yeah.
Arson
Yeah, yeah,
something or
something
other.
like that
Yeah.
guy.
Who describes himself as a international human rights lawyer and
What's so strange to me is,
uh,
and
too
you
busy
have more
promoting
experience with
genocide.
yeah, you have more experience with these people than I do. But were they always this ridiculous? Like, or is
Actually,
this
I don't.
post-genocide?
I don't. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
thankfully you're the one with more experience with.
Oh yeah.
But no, they've a colleague of mine has described kind of their attitude certainly since October 2023 quite accurately, I think, is genocide mania. I mean, they can't get
Mm,
enough of it,
yeah,
and you can practically feel their enthusiasm
yeah.
as you read their material. It's really I mean, I think your work is very important, but I think at some stage your work needs to be complemented by that of a professional psychologist to better understand these people. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that facetiously.
Maureen, like I have to say, my worldview has, I don't know, I'm guessing you're, just because of your disreputable context, like Mr. Finkelstein, that's tongue in cheek. I'm guessing you're more left wing than I am, but I have to say,
No, I'm
maybe
told I'm
not.
a jihadi Islamist
Okay,
Hamas
yeah. Well,
Iran
I'm
Nazi
a jihadist.
supporter.
I am
So,
a,
yeah.
I mean, my name is
Well, at
Cockerell,
least you have
but
a beard.
because I, because I have an Egyptian mother who's Christian. I'm an Egyptian Islamist. I'm told like on
Yeah.
Twitter all day. But like, the what was I? Oh yeah. But I have to say, my worldview has really been shaken by this because I guess what I would have said before the war, the genocide, is you know, the West is hypocritical. We've had our atrocities, but the arrow was pointed the right way, right? Intellectually, morally, and no, it's. I mean, I feel like that was very naive. It also, I mean, obviously, like participation in a genocide is the salient question that's moral, but just the level of intellectual discourse, as we talked about, like the fact that these people are taken seriously. Look, Steven Pinker, in email exchange with me, cited John Spencer. Pinker is supposed to be one of our top intellectuals. So it's just how easily we can be corrupted intellectually is also disturbing to me because
Well,
these
in
arguments are
that
not
sense, it
compelling.
didn't come as a surprise to me. And if you're looking at it that
Mm.
way, it's really always been there. You know, the Iraq War just being a very recent example. Certainly, if you're talking specifically about Palestine, you know, every stone throwing school child during the first Intifada was a terrorist and deserved to be shot through the heart and so on. So there's not much new there. You know, having spoken about these individuals, are there others I should mention who've kind of, well, we mentioned this leading international something or other.
Well, there was a
But
guy on Twitter the other day whom, by the way, whom Fox, he didn't explicitly endorse his work, but he was like triumphantly, oh, Spencer endorsed it. So let's talk about Spencer. There was a guy on Twitter who the other day, and I had to spend an afternoon debunking this asshole. I'm upset he took away that part of my life from me. But he claimed because of his own error converting, and he had implicitly admitted this. He admitted his inferences were bunk, but he claimed that there were thousands of repeating ID numbers in the Ministry of Health data. And I had looked at this before, and I'm like, there's no way that's correct. And I
and
spent
hold on, these are published in English, not Arabic, correct?
correct, yeah. And I spent hours and hours, and I found there's no repeating. Right, there's zero in their latest rendition, and also in the one he was citing in an earlier rendition. And then he basically admitted, oh yeah, there was a problem converting from copying the numbers from a PDF to an Excel document. So that
Mm,
is the kind. And John Spencer immediately when this guy posted it, like retweeted and said, like, very careful, good study. So again, that's the level of intellectual
mm,
that's the level of stupidity we're dealing with. I mean,
mm,
there isn't that's another problem. There's not an epistemic. I mean, we have clowns on our side, of course, but against the genocide. But there is, in general, there is not an there's not an epistemic equality or equality of scrupulosity,
mm,
and that actually gives them an advantage because they can just lie so shamelessly
mm.
and
And
point that, yeah.
speaking of shameless lying, tell us more about the Henry Jackson Society.
I'm a little less knowledgeable on that. I know that like
Mm,
Douglas Murray used to work there. They're like
mm,
neoconservative.
mm,
They supported they were established after the Iraq War, but they were supportive of it. I'm not.
Mm.
I'm not quite sure of all of their machinations. I know they published Andrew Fox. That's kind of
Mm.
enough. They published a ridiculous report by
Mm.
Fox,
Mm.
where, it's just, again, it's just dishonesty. So, first of all, he takes errors by the Ministry of Health, like misclassification of
Mm.
men as women, that are not, in terms of the scale, are not significant. They don't change the
Not
big picture.
statistically significant.
Right. And the other thing he does is he doesn't mention that, well, women are also misclassified as men.
Mm.
So these two things cancel each other out, and that's evidence that they're not trying to inflate women, right? They're making mistakes at a very small scale. But he
And
doesn't
making
mention that.
mistakes
Yeah.
in a context in which civilian government healthcare sector has been
Right.
systematically targeted in the midst of a genocide. So,
Right.
you don't expect perfection even in Sweden.
Yeah. Exactly.
Mm.
Yeah. And what you want is mistakes at a scale that aren't going to affect the big picture.
And
You
that are
want
corrected
you
when
want
they're
corrections and transparency as to
Mm.
the mistakes, and they've provided that.
Mm.
So
But nevertheless, these characters that we've just
mm,
discussed, they seem to have two missions. One is which to um, repeat and proclaim, kind of like a Pavlovian canine, anything and everything that is claimed by the Israeli government, and particularly the Israeli military. The other one is that they seem to have dedicated much of the past 2 years to undermining the credibility of one institution in particular, the Palestinian Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip.
right, yeah, that seems to be their project, and it's been a huge mistake.
Mhm.
They haven't landed a blow. I mean, their latest. This relates to a piece I have coming out next week. Their latest attempt, which actually seemed like this might have been the missile that hit, if as it
Mhm.
were, right? Was they had found these a few thousand names, and this is
Yeah, we'll
actually
get to that if you don't
sure,
mind. We'll get to that in a minute.
sure.
Because I first wanted to ask you about another issue, which is that more recently, at least some of these individuals we've been discussing began very loudly claiming that I'm not sure if they're referring to Hamas or the Ministry of Health or both, that they released figures demonstrating that no less than 72% of all Palestinian casualties in the Gaza Strip are military-aged men. And my question to you is, well, it's interesting that suddenly these people who have dedicated so much effort and invested so much of their time into demolishing the reputation of the Palestinian Ministry of Health are suddenly considering its figures to be reliable, if not infallible. But is this actually what was reported? Was there actually a document that claimed that 72% of all Palestinian casualties are military-aged men?
No, so this is based on confusion, and also it may have been misleading on purpose by Eisenberg, but it nevertheless effectively misled Fox News, journalists for the Telegraph, so various media. Um, what is true is that if you take a subset of the total fatalities,
Mhm.
meaning persons between the age of 13 and 55, 72% of them are men. And there's two reasons for that. First of all,
But
this,
but
sorry,
you're
Mouin?
excluding all preteens and
Exactly.
all senior citizens.
And all elderly, exactly. So if you take this subset, which is going to include all of the combatants, right?
Mhm.
Obviously, it's not all combatants. They're not going to be 13-year-old
But virtually
combatants.
all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, but basically every combatant is going to
Yeah.
be in this
Yeah.
group. And you also have the phenomenon we talked about earlier, which adult male civilians are going, and older boys too, are going to be overrepresented among civilian fatalities. So among this subset of fatalities, 72% are males. But it's not true, and not at all true, that 72% of total fatalities are males 13 to 55. In point of fact, the bare majority of fatalities are women and children. And I may add, the first time that's happened in any war for violent fatalities since the Rwandan genocide. So they're not only distorting these data, but the actual data are shocking. If you know how to look at them, if you have experience looking at these kind of data.
So you're basically saying that if you look at all armed conflicts, um, let's say over the past half century, you consistently see a pattern where the majority of casualties are men or
Yes,
males,
definitely.
whether combatants or civilians, and that you've come across only two cases where more than 50% of casualties have been women and children, the first being the 1994 Rwanda genocide, and the second being Gaza. Did I understand you correctly?
That's correct. Although I would say my reading of the data only goes back 31 years. So I wouldn't.
Okay.
I think half a century would be too strong. There
Yeah.
might be other
Okay.
examples I
Sorry about
haven't
that.
seen. No,
Yeah.
no. But I think it's still, we're talking a third of a century, right?
Yeah.
And there've
You're
been a
talking
lot of
about
armed conflicts.
former Yugoslavia,
Yes, where there was a genocide.
DRC. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're talking about multiple genocides too. So
Yeah.
Darfur is another case of a genocide, but the total, if you look at the total fatalities, the majority are not are men, right? Are adult
Mhm.
men.
Mhm.
Same with the Rohingya genocide, same with the Bosnian genocide. Of course, Srebrenica, they're specifically targeting
Yeah,
men.
well,
And
Srebrenica was a genocide, and
yeah,
100% of the casualties were male
right. Yeah,
boys.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it doesn't, but that case is a little bit
Yeah, it's
misleading
unique in
because
a
they
way. Yeah.
specifically targeting the males.
Mm,
But nevertheless, if you look at other genocides in this time span since Rwanda, they have not had majority of fatalities be women and children. So the point is that simply the fact that men are overrepresented in the fatalities, which they are, doesn't prove anything. What's shocking is the extent to which they are overrepresented, which is much lower than in almost any other war in this time span, right?
And you're also claiming that those who are asserting that it is meaningful know better.
Oh, I think by now they do,
Mhm.
because I've like corrected them. But I think these people were really ignorant at the beginning. I mean, like someone like Spencer, I'm sure he knows a million times more than I do about the tactics of like, we're talking tactics, like what you teach a
How to
cadet
shoot
of
up a
urban,
building.
sure, but it doesn't give him knowledge of strategy, doesn't give him knowledge of operational design, doesn't give him knowledge of military history.
Mm,
And he's claimed knowledge of these subjects where obviously he has a very shallow understanding.
mm,
I think the same would apply to Fox and to Eisenberg.
mm,
These guys don't know what the hell they're talking about.
mm,
Like, again, I'm not blaming a layperson. If a layperson who doesn't know like casualty patterns in war sees men are overrepresented, they might think, oh, maybe that debunks the claims of genocide and so forth. I don't think everybody who does this is in bad faith.
mm.
But I mean, at this point, these guys are, yeah,
Yeah,
because
well, I
this has
think I
been
think
pointed out
mm,
over and over again by people like me and Mike Spagat.
mm,
Spagat being an economist and one of the world's experts
mm,
on casualty counting war. And by the way, Spagat, though his opinions have moved throughout the war,
yeah,
was very moderate at the beginning. He didn't have strong ideological
that's
views,
right.
Mike.
Yeah.
He's a friend at this point, but I don't want to speak for him, but I'll say
He
this.
was almost dismissive of the genocide charge in the beginning, if I recall,
I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I will say
or very
this.
skeptical. Huh.
I don't know, but he's changed his views, and it's because of the data.
Mm,
It's because of the data, and it's because of a comparative look at the data.
mm,
I mean, it's shocking. It is genuinely shocking.
mm. But I mean, what's interesting here is you're saying, a layperson
Mhm.
can't really be faulted for looking at the statistics and drawing a certain conclusion about them. But I think what's interesting here is they're not just looking at the statistics and drawing their own conclusion. You have these figures like Spencer and Fox and Eisenberg who have a huge platform, who proclaim themselves to be the world's leading experts on this issue, who are ceaselessly promoted by the media and so on. And so it's not just, the layperson looking at statistics and drawing conclusions. It's having these statistics interpreted for them by people who they are told are authoritative experts, while people like you and Professor Spaggett and so on have a much smaller platform.
Yeah. It's true, and it's you guys need to get me on Piers Morgan and get Mike on Piers Morgan, right? All you listeners. I mean, it's frustrating though because leaving aside some personal ego element where it's like, fuck, I've done my work and I know the facts here, and these guys don't, which I think every kind of youngish scholar has sometimes, right? When it comes to misinformation in the public domain. It's also that there isn't really a body promoting our work, right? And again, it's very conservative work, grounded in military history, grounded in data. Um, we both came to this, by the way, too. I began the war much. I mean, I was against. It was easy to be against the war because of the genocidal language, but I did not call it genocide. I did not. I did not even accuse Israel of deliberately targeting civilians. I suspected they were, but I was not convinced of it. Really, the big thing that convinced me was um, the results, which we've talked about, but also finding that through the Air Wars study and others that,
Tell us about that.
yeah. So I'll just talk about briefly what the Air Wars study and how it convinced me
And
that,
and and what is Air Wars?
yeah. So Air Wars is an NGO
Mhm.
which tracks civilian fatalities in an air wars, as it were.
Mhm.
It began as a means of tracking civilian fatalities in the war against the Islamic State. I think that was a very noble endeavor because important because the war against the Islamic State was so popular. You even had ISIS was so reviled, understandably, for its horrible atrocities, genocidal, genocide against the Yazidi peoples, that even people in the region, right, people who might be killed by U.S. airstrikes against ISIS, were generally, from my understanding of the polling, generally supportive of the coalition, and people in the West were overwhelmingly supportive. So somebody needed to track civilian fatalities in that war because there was so little kind of accountability or public opposition, right? And they did. And they operate based on open sources, and they specifically track, social media, local media, Telegram. They track credible reports of fatalities and corroborate them in open sources. And in the context of the Gaza war, they had a shocking study in October 2023. Many shocking figures, shattering all records of women and children killed in the month of bombing that they've ever tracked since their founding in 2014.
Sorry, looking
Um,
at only the first month of
yeah,
Israel's onslaught on
but
the
but one
Gaza Strip.
important thing, one important thing that really was a tilting point for me was that almost all of the civilian fatalities were coming in the bombing of homes. And this is one area where I think the solidarity movement needs to do a much better job bringing attention to, is that 90% of the women and children killed were killed in the bombing of homes where there was no military activity. So for me, that was a tilting point because the kind of Hail Mary pass the Israelis have, which is, okay, this is all really bad. And we know you're not an idiot, so we have to admit it's really bad, but it's because of human shields, right? Or
Mm.
because of embedding among civilians would be the better way of describing it. And I thought, the human shields thing, we can go over that, but I didn't buy that framing. But what I did buy is that, Hamas is a guerrilla group. They're embedding among civilians. It's a very densely populated area. Who knows? Maybe that accounts for some large percentage of these shocking data. But the Air Wars study showed they're just bombing homes where there's no military activity. That's where the large majority of these civilian fatalities are coming from. So it's not, even under the Israeli definition, it isn't human shields.
Mm.
It's just,
And this ghoulish term, collateral damage, wouldn't apply.
well, okay, so that's a more complicated question, but in my view, it wouldn't because I think that the Where's Daddy program
Mm.
clearly involved the deliberate targeting of civilians
Mm.
with, like, you have a Hamas guy who's a junior militant and you kill a whole multi-generational family and you do this systematically. To me, and we can talk about the evidence for this, but the evidence stacks up much more strongly with the deliberate targeting of civilians with some kind of cover story to limit this operation, right? Because they can't kill every civilian in Gaza, right? They're not going to be able to get away with that. Um, that they were effectively were targeting civilians with the Where's Daddy program. But my point in this connection is that the embedding among civilians, the human shields claim, is no excuse, is no mitigating factor with most of these civilian fatalities because they're bombing homes where there's no militant activity. It's just there's one Hamas guy who's asleep, right, on the couch, and you kill the whole family.
Right.
And they're doing this over and over again. So
Well, what I
that,
meant is it's not like they're aiming for something that they have identified, for example, as a command center and
oh yeah,
having to
yeah,
bring down the building
definitely.
next to it.
Definitely. No, no, they weren't
Okay.
doing that. They were aiming for the people in the building. And the question is then, were they just aiming for the guy in the building, the Hamas guy,
Or the
and it's
building.
or the people or the whole
Mm,
family
mm,
itself? And I think the evidence is much better for the latter than the former interpretation. But regardless, this is the main reason um, why there's so many civilians being killed and why there's so many women and children being killed compared to all these other wars, including wars that involve deliberate targeting. It's this bombing of homes over and over again, systematically full of women and children with no militant activity. They're not bases or anything. So they're not killing combatants. They're at most killing one combatant and then the whole family
right.
with him. Yeah.
So, shifting gears, between August of last year, August 2024, and March of this year, the Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip removed no less than 3,000 names from its list of confirmed casualties. That's more than 5% of the total number of casualties it has registered since October 2023. Among those removed were 1,079 children. In other words, there were 1,079 names of children on its casualty list who were suddenly removed from the casualty list. On the face of it, that appears to be a pretty staggering error. And indeed, Andrew Fox and Salo Eisenberg, who we've discussed in this conversation, upon noticing these changes, seized upon them, claiming that the Ministry of Health had, I'm quoting them now, been accepting names onto the list with no evidence whatsoever. I believe that's a direct quote. The implication that none of the ministry's statistics can or should be trusted was quickly endorsed by the pro-Israeli media, including, of course, the Daily Tory Graph, Fox News, and needless
Hmm.
to say, the New York Post. Now, the reason I'm asking you about this is because you have just completed a study, again for Action on Armed Violence, AOAV, which I believe is expected to be published next week. And it included a detailed examination of the discrepancies publicized by Fox and Eisenberg. But once again, you reached a very different verdict. In fact, you came to the conclusion that far from inflating Gaza's death toll, the Ministry of Health's approach suggests that the official figures are likely conservative. That struck me as a rather strange conclusion, Matt, because given these massive discrepancies, I suspect most people will find your conclusions, to put it mildly, somewhat curious, and conclude that Fox and Eisenberg are much closer to the mark. You know, there's a reason that 5% of the casualties have suddenly disappeared from the data. What's your response?
Would you mind, Maureen, if I shared my screen for a second?
By all means.
Let's see if that works. Okay. So my response is, can you see this?
Yes.
Awesome. So my response is effectively here. So as you mentioned, like it's a lot of fatalities they removed. And I thought maybe the reason I looked into these claims is because I thought maybe they've actually gotten a direct hit for once. After a year and a half of flailing,
Trying.
they may have actually found significant errors by the Ministry of Health. And I thought, maybe that they're making a lot of mistakes. Maybe they're classifying a ton of natural deaths as violent deaths. And I decided, and really my team in Gaza, yes, in Gaza, right? They're right in Gaza right now, the four-person team, whom I'll mention in the piece. You have to think about protecting identity, but they deserve the overwhelming majority of the credit for this research, not me. But what we did is we looked at open sources. and Facebook, Instagram, local media, and so forth. And we looked at these names, not all 3,000, but the children who'd been removed, which Eisenberg
The
emphasized.
1,079 children.
Yes. And we found that the large majority were in fact killed, confirmed to have been killed. And of these, the majority of the 61% or so who had been killed were violent deaths. And only a very small number, 12, we found were indirect deaths. Now, there's a big
12
chunk.
out of more than 1,000.
Yeah, now there's a big chunk, 24% that died. We're not sure of the cause. Although in many cases we have some evidence, circumstantial evidence of violent deaths. And we don't have any cases of circumstantial evidence of indirect deaths. Then we have cases where we suspect death, but we're not sure. Like this is an example is if this appeared in the Al Jazeera fatalities list, the child. The reason we didn't say that's enough to confirm it is because the Al Jazeera is partially basing their tally on the government ministry office, which we found has promoted misinformation, right? So I think it's unlikely that the government media office would like say a specific name of a person has died if they haven't, but given that they're not a reliable source, we listed those as suspected deaths. Then there are some cases where there's just no evidence of the person in open source. As you can see here, the 16%, we just don't find any evidence one way or another. And then there were a handful of cases, 33, where there were clear mistakes made by the Ministry of Health. So people who are alive, we found maybe
33 cases or 33%?
33 cases. So 3% of the total. People who are alive, people who were arrested, right? They may not have died. They were arrested by the Israelis. People who were injured but survived. People who were double counted. But the point is, if you look at these data, the large majority of them were killed. And of those, we can assess the overwhelming majority of deaths were caused by violence. They were not natural or indirect deaths. So what's there to conclude from this? I'll just remove sharing really quick. Okay.
Yeah, well, you do that. That begs a question. If these were violent deaths, why were they removed from the list to begin with?
Right. So that's the most funny part of this. They have tried for a year and a half to find the Ministry of Health is inflating deaths, and they have accumulated a very, very small number of mistakes. I've actually found far more mistakes. I have found hundreds, and they're overwhelmingly errors of omission, errors of deflation. And I think the reason for that is that they have very conservative standards which they're applying. So why would they remove, why would they remove cases where there's a picture on Facebook of a poor child who's been shot in the head, which I've seen, right, by the Israelis, or a child who's been bombed to death? Why would they remove that? It's because they're applying their standards consistently. They have two criteria that they use to assess a death. One is a body has to be seen by a Ministry of Health worker. The other is that there has to be a formal judicially approved finding of death. And these criteria, which I believe they were a little loose on applying at one point because some of these names got on the list just because a family reported it. But I think they're retrospectively being more careful in applying these standards because of the errors, right? Because of the 3% errors. The 33 errors, they probably found that there's a higher error rate in deaths that don't meet their standards and deaths that do. But they're applying a conservative standard, which is resulting in them removing vastly more real violent deaths than they're removing mistakes. And this, I think, supports the inference which the Lancet study from earlier this year showed, not the note that talked about hundreds of thousands of deaths, which I don't think was very credible, frankly, but a study from earlier this year by the Lancet, which assessed.
And this was not a letter. This was a peer-reviewed article.
Yes, right. This study assessed that the Ministry of Health is undercounting by tens of thousands. And I think that's probably accurate because their methods are very conservative. And they're going to be people like the children that we learned about through our study, who clearly were killed. There's pictorial evidence in many cases and so forth, very gruesome pictorial evidence, very sad. They're removing real deaths. And why would they be doing that? Well, because they're applying conservative standards across the board. Or maybe there was one officer, a bureaucrat in the Ministry of Health who was less conservative, who would put names on the list if the parent. My suspicion is that some people were putting names on the list once a parent or family made the online application to the Ministry of Health, and others were abiding more strictly by their criteria, which says no, we have to have seen a body or there has to be a judicial finding. And my hypothesis is that the reason for these removals is that the Ministry of Health decided to apply their more conservative standards across the board consistently.
And then we also have to bear in mind it's a small society. We're talking about
Yeah.
at most, 2 million people in a postage stamp sized territory where many people know each other or of each other. And it's quite possible that, under the current catastrophic conditions, that perhaps reporting was taken on faith or because, people had heard of these cases. I'm talking about individual bureaucrats. And then once the supervisors looked into it, you began to see names being removed. Is that a possibility as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But the mystery we have here, though, is so when I got into this research, I didn't think they were lying, but I thought there was a big mistake that must have been made, and that perhaps these were natural deaths or disappearances in the large majority. But as you can see, only a very, very small percentage of them are. And the best assumption is that the large majority of these are violent deaths. So um, I think the best inference is that they're applying some kind of neutral conservative criteria,
Mhm.
which is leading to the removal of, mostly real violent deaths. Although they're also removing mistakes, right? It's not that. So it may be that they're in the right for doing this, because do you really want 3% of your list to be errors? That's a
Yeah,
lot, right?
yeah. And the implications are, just to make sure that I understood you clearly. The Ministry of Health is now reporting something on the order of 55, 56,000 total casualties, um, civilians and combatants,
Mhm.
of whom your research shows that something like three-quarters of them, and potentially more, are civilians. And you're saying that that figure, and here I'm talking about the numbers, not the percentages, is almost certainly undercounted by tens of thousands of additional Palestinians who have been killed as a result of Israeli military attacks.
I'd say almost certainly many thousands and
Mhm.
probably tens of thousands. That's how I'd put it. I don't think I'd quite say almost certainly tens of thousands, but I would say probably tens of thousands and definitely many thousands. That's
Yeah.
how I'd put
A
it.
very different picture from the one we typically get is that, we have to treat the Ministry of Health's figures with extreme skepticism and just assume that they're inflated either willfully or as a result of their lack of capacity.
Right. But I mean, my research indicates they're removing hundreds of real violent deaths and a
Mhm.
much smaller number of natural deaths and mistakes.
Mhm.
So, in other words, they're making more errors of omission than errors of commission, or more errors of omission and deflation than errors of commission and inflation.
Right.
And yeah.
So, I have two more questions that I'd like to ask you. The first is whether you've had a chance to look at the latest study published by Fox and Eisenberg, again for the Henry Jackson Society, on human shields. And in this case, they seek to explain Israel's genocide in the Gaza Strip as
Mm,
effectively a legitimate campaign
mm,
for which Hamas bears responsibility, because
mhm,
Israel, of course, has no agency and is never responsible for anything it does, for which Hamas bears responsibility because it has transformed the civilian
mhm.
population of the Gaza Strip into a human shield.
I read this not super carefully, but
Mhm.
I think I can assess the general human shields argument pretty well just from military
Mhm.
history. So, um, Hamas embeds among civilians 100%. Why do they do this? Is it because they want to kill their own civilians to make Israel look bad? I I have to say I have no sympathy for Hamas as an organization, but it seems much more plausible to me based on military history, what the Viet Cong did, right? By tunneling under civilian infrastructure. That they basically have built this tunnel system and embedded because they're waging a guerrilla war and an asymmetric guerrilla war. Their assessment was, look, if we fight Israel in the field with fully identifying ourselves, we have zero tanks, zero planes, zero viable anti-aircraft guns, zero artillery. So we'll get destroyed by Israel's American provided munitions in a few hours, right? So
If
they don't
that.
want to get yeah. So they don't want to get destroyed, and therefore they've created a form of conflict, with historical antecedents. I mentioned the Viet Cong, for example, um, that facilitates ambushes, hits and run, and will prevent Hamas from having to fight the Israelis head on, where they would definitely lose. So I think that's a much more plausible interpretation of Hamas's motivations than that they're in a conspiracy to try to kill their civilians to make Israel look bad. And again, I'm no friend of this group,
Well,
but yeah.
yeah, you've provided a plausible explanation of Hamas's motivations, but you haven't answered the question. Well, that may be why they're doing this, but why doesn't that amount to human shielding of deliberately using the civilian population to shield Hamas from attack by the Israeli military? My response to that would be that not just Hamas, but any Palestinian, who's been alive for long enough, understands very carefully, very clearly that there's absolutely no point to using
Right.
civilians or civilian infrastructure as a defense mechanism because Israel has never shown any regard for civilians or civilian infrastructure. But I'd like to hear um, your response to the direct accusation that
Mhm.
Hamas is, and without getting into, the technical definition of what is and what is not a human shield, because I don't think
Yeah.
that's what Fox and Eisenberg are doing, that they are deliberately embedding within the civilian population and civilian infrastructure um, out of a belief that doing so will shield them from Israeli attack.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that needs that much addressing. It's absurd. The one point I just draw back to is the Air Wars study, and I think it's relevant to the human shields question because and this was a big change in my thinking on this because the back of my mind is like, well, there's so many civilians being killed at such a high rate. They're lying about how many, but maybe this is because the only way they can get many of their targets is bombing some building Hamas has militarized, right? Some civilian building. And if you look at the data from the open sources, the overwhelming majority of civilian casualties have nothing to do with what even under the Israeli definition is human shielding. They're just bombing non-militarized homes, killing everyone in there to kill one alleged Hamas guy. I don't think that's the actual motive. I think they want to kill civilians too at a certain rate. But let's take it at their word that still this doesn't have anything to do with human shielding or embedding among civilians, whatever the motive. I mean, if Sinwar, there's this reports the other week, if Sinwar really was in a hospital, in tunnels that ran beneath the hospital, that's obviously totally reprehensible. There's no excusing that. We can talk about the motive. We can talk about whether we should believe every aspect of the story Israel's telling. I don't think we should. But what's important is to look at how are people dying in Gaza? Are they dying in these kind of scenarios the Israelis and Fox and Eisenberg dream up, where it's there's combatants in this civilian infrastructure, and we have to bomb it to kill the combatants, and it's going to kill a lot of civilians, or are they just been bombing homes where one guy's sleeping and there's no military activity? No, it's the latter, right? So regardless of what we call this, human shields or not human shields. I don't think Hamas's motives are to kill their own civilians. But even if people believe that, the vast majority of these airstrikes, or at least the large majority, I don't know about vast, but certainly the large majority of these airstrikes have nothing to do with embedding among civilians, right? They're very autonomous decisions by an Air Force that has total air superiority. There's no, well, that's not even the right term. There's no Air Force for Hamas or real anti-aircraft munitions. So it's not being caused by this embedding. And we have to get that out there because I think this is like the last for me at least, this was the last thing that was like half
Yeah.
persuasive.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's the case with a lot of people, this human shields thing.
Yeah.
And I think we have to get the truth out that no, they're like just bombing homes full of families. Like that's how most people have been killed. It's not this embedding, right?
Yeah, and I just like to point out that the human shielding actually consists of two elements. The first is the one you've just emphasized. These are barbarians who attach no value to life and absolutely no value to the lives of those they rule because they're Muslims and jihadists and whatnot, and are therefore doing this in order to increase the Palestinian casualty count for the purpose of making Israel look bad. So, in other words,
Right.
this genocide is kind of a PR initiative. But the other, and in my view, the more nefarious claim being made on Israel's behalf is that because Hamas is deliberately embedding among civilians and within civilian infrastructure, um, in the hope that that will cause the Israeli military to refrain from hitting them, that it's because of them that Palestinians are being directly exposed to Israeli fire, and therefore it creates a situation where you can kind of accept that there is a
Mhm.
genocide, but Israel has no responsibility for it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Certainly, this argumentative structure,
Mm.
the point of it is to absolve Israel of responsibility for the airstrikes. That's clearly the purpose of this. So and I have to say it didn't I didn't believe this entirely. But I thought it was truer to a much larger extent than it is. Like
Mm.
it's
Well,
I don't think the motivation is true at all, but the embedding among civilians is causing some level of fatalities. But it's a small percentage of what we're seeing. And we have to get the truth out there about that because I think this is, I mean, just maybe I'm projecting, but I really feel like the human shields thing is the one piece of
last man
lies and
standing.
propaganda. Yeah, it's like the one thing that people still buy into, who know a lot of this is a lie at this point, right?
Mm.
And we have the data to debunk it. The data is just people are dying in their homes or there's no military activity. They actually have a name for this program. You've probably covered this. It's called Where's Daddy?
Yeah.
Yeah, this I believe has killed. I think Where's Daddy and then just massacring people in their kill zones. I
Mhm.
think that is probably the overwhelming majority of fatalities in Gaza. I mean, for my research, when I looked at the cause of death, I actually created a column called "Where's Daddy?" question mark, and over again, the violent deaths fell into "Where's Daddy?"
Hmm.
They were
Just
bombing
take a
a
moment,
home.
if you
Yeah.
might, to tell us about Where's Daddy, because many viewers
hmm
may not be familiar with it. It's an AI program.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Where's Daddy is a program the Israelis developed where they systematically bomb homes where they think one Hamas guy is. It's usually a junior militant. It can also be somebody who just is a civilian, right? Who works for Hamas, who works for the government there. And there's also a very high error rate. I think the Israelis admit it's 10%. But regardless, they pursuant to this program, which alerts them as to when a guy who was,
Through a mobile phone signal or
yeah, alerts
something.
them when he's at home visiting his family or sleeping or whatever. They just bomb the home, right, and kill everyone in it. And I believe, and I have to say, I think this has been criminally underemphasized by our side of the things, the anti people who are against the genocide, that this is the reason that so many women and children have been killed. This is the reason why there are many reasons, but the primary reason why this is the only war since Rwanda where a majority or close to majority of violent fatalities of women and children. It's because it's not just indiscriminate bombing. There's a lot of that too, but
It's very discriminate bombing.
they're discriminately bombing homes. These are direct hits on homes. And just to mention, one of the reasons why I think that this is not simply just wildly disproportionate, but amounts to murder is they use dumb bombs for these. It's been reported that they use dumb bomb, and you can find munitions in some cases that corroborate this. They're using dumb bombs for these "Where's Daddy" airstrikes, as opposed to smart bombs where you could potentially take out a room of the
Mm.
apartment, right? Instead, you're kill and not necessarily kill everybody in the home.
Or the
Um,
building.
yeah, and also there's testimonial evidence that there was an element of revenge to this,
Mm.
right? It wasn't simply, it wasn't simply going after the one Hamas guy.
Mm.
So yeah, but the reason they're killing so many civilians and women and children at this rate is I think this is the main reason. I really do. It's certainly it's close. If it
Mm.
isn't the main, it's close. And I think our side has not emphasized that enough.
Mm.
Um, Another thing I'd mention in this connection. Um, Sorry, I think I just zoned out a second and maybe tried to, and I'll try to reclaim my thought, but maybe try to save me for 10 seconds, Mouin,
Yeah,
while I
no
try.
problem. But this is an artificial intelligence program. I believe it was first revealed by Plus 972 magazine,
Mhm.
an Israeli magazine, and it showed how the purpose of this AI program was to be able to locate Hamas activists. We're not talking about senior commanders,
Right,
but essentially anyone who had any connection with the movement.
right,
And it was designed not just to assassinate them, but specifically to assassinate them when they entered their homes. That's where the program. That's where the program got its name. And because of the way that this, and then in October 2023, the criteria were very significantly loosened, allowing for much higher numbers of casualties in order to eliminate a single person of much lower rank. Um, and the results are exactly as you've explained.
right. Yeah. And again, the Where's Daddy program really is a good debunk for human shielding or embedding, because this doesn't have anything to do with embedding,
Well, unless you consider someone sitting
actually,
in their own home embedding.
the
Hmm.
streamer Loner Box claimed that a Hamas guy like having family and like going to visit them is human shield. So,
Hmm.
but I don't think I think this is a good thing to emphasize in our public presentations because I don't think a normal person would think that.
Hmm.
I mean, it isn't, and I don't think a normal person would find that
Hmm.
persuasive.
Matt Cockerill, I really want to thank you for what's been an absolutely fascinating, extremely rich, and extraordinarily informative discussion. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on Connections.
Thank you, Maureen. It was a blast. So, take care.